the most effective thing, just to increase the options. Of course, they also need to taste good, but increasing options is really one of the first things that has to be considered. And here it really makes sense to go for options that are indeed the most sustainable and the healthiest, which would be plant-based. Set the standards, so try to make the plant-based option the default, maybe the first one in the menu aisle, easiest to order, the cheapest, and really invest something that option also tastes good, which in many colleges has been, I know from personal experience, a problem. Make it appealing. There are now lots of courses that chefs can go to. There are other workshops staff can go to. I know the TUCO, the University Catering Organization, has run some workshops, for example, so that can be a great thing. They also have a greenhouse gas tool, so you can whilst you undergo some training, you can also calculate actually what the change in footprints is, which is very useful. Another thing is to experiment, try maybe different ordering of menu options, fruits at checkout, and things like that. That can have a little bit of an effect, it seems. Providing information in addition to making any changes is always important, though to a degree, it seems. So there has been this policy in Cambridge that you probably heard of, where they took beef off the menu, and apparently they actually didn't tell anybody, and nobody complained. So that can actually work as well. So only if you sort of people seem to be averse to something being taken away, right? So if you phrase it in that way, instead of, oh, we improve diets for everybody, then you can get probably different reactions to that. And clearly, it's an improvement if you make the canteen offering more healthier and more sustainable. Second to last, address also dietary intake. A big problem in the UK and other high-income countries is overweight and obesity, and you saw that was also a big piece in the health when it comes to health aspects. So there you can think about having more lower calorie meals, and here again, plant-based options tend to be somewhat lower. But of course, that also means maybe people need to eat a bit more often, but smaller portions. So experimenting with flexible opening hours could help to address that to some degree. And then lastly, evaluate yourself, track progress to some goals. For example, 50% of all sales should be plant-based, also could be such a goal, and see how you do with it. If you want to go all in and experiment even more, we have done a lot of work on pricing in the unintended consequences of food consumption, which are, for example, climate change and the healthcare costs that are associated with ill health. And there we found that if you factor in the climate estimates of climate damages into the prices of foods, red meat, for example, or beef specifically, should be 40% more expensive on average, and dairy around 20% more expensive. If you factor in the health costs, processed meat should be almost double its cost, and unprocessed red meat around 30% more expensive. So you see, those are tremendous costs that are at the moment not really taken into account, that would provide an additional incentive for people to switch to options that are not only healthier and more sustainable, but then also cheaper if you factor in those costs. And if you experiment with costs, you might have some revenue at hand that you could use for increasing opening hours or offering a greater variety of plant-based options. So I think I'll leave it with that. Those were just some slides to this. If you want to read up on any of those things, we have like country level results for the UK in any of those studies that I mentioned in passing. But yeah, I'm looking forward to having discussion with you now.
Thanks so much, Marco. I think that was a very comprehensive, I guess, overview of possible options. that we hadn't ever considered before, obviously. But yeah, I guess going back to the health point, how sure are we that, eating lots of red meat, for example, causes bad health? And to what extent is that, a hypothesis?
Oh, we're pretty sure, I would say. So, end of 2015, the Cancer Agency of the World Health Organization classified unprocessed red meat as likely carcinogenic to humans based on strong mechanistic evidence, and observational evidence as well. And it classified processed red meat as carcinogenic to humans. Again, also based on very strong mechanistic evidence. And in order for the Cancer Agency of the World Health Organization to make such a statement, usually one needs sort of three tiers of evidence. So what we usually see in epidemiology, and now with COVID, everybody seems to know what epidemiology is. You have those large trials, right? And there you can tease out effects of food consumption choices if you administer dietary surveys and then track people over time and see what they get ill from. Those cohort studies, as they are called, they always show that if those people that consume higher amounts of red and processed meat have higher risk of coronary heart disease, stroke, type 2 diabetes, and colorectal cancer. If you summarize all of them in what is called a meta-analysis, you get some kind of consensus estimates of different cohort studies around the world. And also those show very consistent evidence that red and processed meat increases those risks. And they not only show that there is this one increase, but that it increases in what we call the dose response function. So if you eat more, you have more risk, and that is a good indication of that might be indeed not only a statistical association, but pointing to a causal association. And then there are animal studies and studies on intermediate risk factors like blood pressure, cholesterol levels, and so on. And they paint a very similar picture. So any kind of body that actually collates those information says very clearly that red and processed meat is indeed associated with increases in those risks.
And yesterday with Tara, we spoke about how different people might have different nutritional requirements. And would you say that this planetary health diet is then safe for somebody who is in their teenage years and is menstruating, as well as somebody who is a middle-aged man in their 50s?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I mean, this planetary health diet is even not like super strict, right? As I said, you according to that, you could have some moderate amount of animal source foods, and we did run nutritional profiles on those recommendations also for different age groups, and it's totally fine. Obviously, the more plant-based you go, you sometimes need to watch B vitamins. That is more of a concern actually than iron. With iron, it seems to be that if you have low iron levels, your body actually becomes a bit more sensitive to iron, so you process iron better. But it obviously takes a bit of time. But with iron intake, we didn't have a problem in the analysis we run. Also, to put that into perspective, the lots of dietetic societies around the world, including the ones from the US and Italy, even consider a completely plant-based diet, which is even stricter than what we recommend, appropriate for all stages of the life course, including children, adolescents, elderly, and during pregnancy. So it's really no problem if you compose your diet well.
That's very reassuring to know, I think. Could you also perhaps maybe kind of just give us a recap of how this fits in the British context? So for example, we don't have those very intensive styles of agriculture in Britain for red meat particularly. So does red meat have a role to play then in our context?
No, so those things really don't differ much, or they differ to some degree, but it really doesn't change the story. So on average, if we, so first of all, from the health side, there is no difference whatsoever, right? So sometimes farmer associations would tell you, oh, you know, like grass-fed beef or so has a better fatty acid composition. And it actually might have a little bit higher levels of unsaturated fats compared to saturated fats, but this is really tiny change, right? Still, the majority of fats in beef would be saturated fats, and we did a risk analysis on that. That doesn't affect the potential health impacts from consumption almost not at all, right? So that is not an argument. And if you come to the environmental one, we know that beef is by far the most environmentally intensive food product. So a kilogram of beef emits in its production about 10 times more than other meats like pork and poultry. And it emits about 100 times as much as plant-based protein sources like legumes, nuts and seeds, or even whole grains. So it's clearly the most environmentally impactful. And the reason for that is that a beef needs a lot of feed, about 10 to 15 kilograms to put on 1 kilogram of body weight. And that feed usually is produced by fertilizing either crops or grassland. So also grassland is fertilized. And whilst fertilizing, a potent greenhouse gas called nitrous oxide is emitted. So because beef is or cows are such inefficient converters, they basically have lots of that footprint through their feed. And in addition, they burp up methane, which is another potent greenhouse gas. So you have those double whammy. And other animal source foods like poultry and pork, whilst they also need multiple times the amount of feed to put on body weight, they don't produce methane directly. So therefore, they have relatively lower emissions. Now, technology or changes in farming practices, going from let's say a very extensive system where cows roam freely, like in Latin America, to something that is a combined milk and dairy system that we have in Europe in most places. That is a bit more intensive. And no matter what farmers say in the UK, it's not that everything is grass-fed in this country. So it really is this combined beef and dairy system here as well. That is far from being only grass-fed. But because you produce two outputs, it's actually double as effective in a sense, or has half the footprint of an extensive system, but half the footprint, that's a factor of 2, right? So that still doesn't get you anywhere close to this factor of 100 that you have between between beef and plant-based sources of protein. So that was a lot of talking now, but that's just to say that the argument doesn't change at all, and it doesn't appear to be that it's actually the opposite might be true, that if you compare grass-fed and intensively reared beef. So because grass-fed seem to actually emit more emissions without being healthier.
Yeah, thanks for that. It seems like, well, I think the impression for me was that grass-fed is, maybe in the 10th percentile of greenhouse gas emissions compared to, the average footprint of an intensively farmed cow. But I feel like it's much worse than that.
So the impact, just to explain that one more time. So this grass-fed is also the reason why grass-fed is higher is because I didn't explain why that is, right? Apparently, when a cow eats grass, it's slightly worse to digest, although it's sort of natural feed, than sort of this grain mix that is highly optimized. And because it's slightly worse to digest, the cow produces more methane. So that is one of the reasons. And if you go to organic system, then usually cows live a little bit longer and have a bit longer time in which they both eat and emit methane. So there it further increases.
That makes a lot more sense now. I see that we're at half past, so I was wondering if anybody in the audience wanted to have any questions. Feel free to type it in the chat or unmute yourself if you want to ask anything. I see Edward has a question. How much of an environmental impact does locally sourced beef and lamb for somewhere like Oxfordshire compare to the global statistics?
Yeah, that's a good question that comes up all the time. The interesting finding here is that transport-related emissions only make up about 5% of food-related emissions. And the reason here is that you can usually transport things very effectively by just packing stuff on a boat, for example. So most things are transport by ship. Companies find it very expensive to fly things around. And even though it's sometimes in the news that, oh, we fly things around, actually most things are not flown around. And if they're flown around, they would be fairly expensive and you wouldn't want to buy them in supermarkets. So this local versus global is really not an issue if you look at the statistics. So what matters more is really what you eat and not where you get it from.
Yeah, I think one of your colleagues, Hannah Ritchie, wrote an article about this, doing lots of calculations, which showed that only 0.16% of all food miles are air flown, and everything else is non-air flown, basically. Hannah, did you have a question?
Yeah, just about the kind of intertextuality of cutting out beef and lamb. So it's kind of more specific to Worcester, but it relates to like the whole shift to plant-based. And basically, I fully support the reduction of beef and lamb. But I think that going as far as completely cutting it out from the diet could be problematic for people with disabilities and, for instance, people with an eating disorder. So I think the extremity of cutting out something could cultivate unhealthy mindsets. I mean, I definitely know from personal experience that my struggle started out from cutting out beef and lamb and kind of escalated from that. So I think that's something we need to be careful of as well. People, for instance, on the autistic spectrum disorder, they have really specific food preferences that sometimes they don't feel able to explain or don't want to explain to people. And I think kind of marketing that off as like a dietary requirement could be quite problematic. And even like the communicative action of requesting another meal could cause social anxiety for them and be triggering. So I think, is there any way that you could kind of balance the two and make sure that it stays inclusive on an intertextual approach?
Yeah, I think Mary and I, when we first spoke about this a long time ago, it was very clear that for anybody who has any kind of welfare requirement, or for anybody who needs it for any medical or health reason, like the options would still be open to eat these foods. It was just to make sure that everybody doesn't have to eat beef and lamb when there are other options to do so for them. So yeah, Mary, did you want to add something to that?
I was just wondering whether Marco has any thoughts on this.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's of course a concern that has to be taken into account. I mean, from a population level, there is really no good reason why a canteen would offer beef and lamb. So as I laid out, it is always associated with an increased risk of health impacts. So also, and that is irrespective of whether whether you have autism, disability, or not, right? So beef wouldn't be good for you in that sense, right? Of course, if you have problems arranging a balanced diet with your disability, then of course you need personal support in putting together a balanced diet, and I think that might be a better way of going about it, because that would be better for you personally as well as for the planet at large, right? So I think those things might be a good strategy, but it's of course good to talk one-on-one on those issues, because that is clearly a concern for a small specific group, right? And it could be that some tailored approaches are really are suitable there, right? But I don't think it needs to necessarily basically bar what you do sort of for the broader population that wouldn't have any problems with those things. And in general, it would always be beneficial for health and required or needed really in order to limit dangerous levels of climate change in the broader population.
I had a quick question about the sort of differences between different meats in terms of their impact on the environment, but also the impact on an individual's health. So, for example, like, is there a significant difference in the nutritional value that can be gained from beef versus chicken, for example?
Right. So lots of times we get caught up on nutrients, right? But the thing is, nutritional value really doesn't tell you if something is healthy or not. So if you compare with what rigor nutritional studies have been carried out, and those nutritional recommended intake values are set, is really pretty shoddy. So very often they cram a couple of undergrads in a laboratory, measure their throughput, and then say, oh, this is sort of what people roughly eat in a country, but they really don't know what very often what good cutoff points are. Also because they wouldn't get that through ethics, you know, like not giving people enough of what they need. So very often those recommended intake values of specific nutrients have huge error bars around them, right? So they really only are very rough indications of what might work, and they don't indicate the whole feedbacks, right? So for example, the calcium recommendations in the UK are completely out of whack in that regard. So they have been set at some point to prevent bone fractures, but we know it's actually not only calcium, it's really the interplay between calcium and vitamin D that is important. So having one level really doesn't make much sense. What is a much better indication is our food groups as such and how they impact dietary risks like heart disease, stroke, cancer, type 2 diabetes. And there is just very clear that what is always associated with a reduction in risk is whole grains, fruits and different fruits and vegetables, legumes, nuts and seeds. And what is always associated with increase is red and processed meat. Dairy is fairly neutral and fish is very neutral. So there, most of the impact seems to be that it's still good not to have basically red meat. And often people who have a bit more dairy or fish have a bit more fruits and vegetables compared to people who have lower amounts and more red meat. So from that perspective, if you focus on having a balanced composition of meals, so one that has different colored fruits and vegetables, because that indicates different minerals, vitamins, phytochemicals, and so on. Have mostly whole grains with it, and legumes and nuts every day if possible. You really don't need to worry about any of those nutrient recommendations. As I said, only B vitamins might be a thing. So there you need to check that you get enough. But other than that, it's really totally fine.
Nice, thank you. We've got a question from Jamie in the chat. He asks, along with the food transport issue, he has two questions actually. One is how much better is shipping compared to air freight, taking biodiversity into account as well as emissions? And his second question is there some way to tell when shopping whether something is shipped or transported by air travel? Yeah,
to the second, no, unfortunately not. And that would be really good if finally companies actually were made to indicate that. As Vihan also said, you really can assume that everything is transported by ship and then by truck once it reaches the shore. So most things wouldn't be air freight. When it comes to impact on biodiversity, here it really matters again what kind of food and not where it comes from. Well, yes, where it comes from, but different foods come from different places. So one of the biggest impacts on biodiversity is again due to cattle. And the reason, so you probably would all have followed all this horrible news about the fires in the Amazon and the deforestation there. That is for probably three things. One is gold mines, one is making way for cattle ranches, and one is for growing more soybeans that are then used to feed cattle and pork actually as well, and chicken. So it's really the overwhelming impact of deforestation and biodiversity loss in those biodiverse rich regions in the world is due to animal source foods. The other following that is palm oil. So that has another big impact in places like Malaysia and Thailand. So that would be another obvious thing to avoid. And palm oil is one of the unhealthiest oils as well. So it's very high in saturated fat compared to unsaturated fat. So that would be the second one. The third one, and people usually don't want to hear it, but my colleague Joseph Poor always mentions that chocolate can have a very high impact on biodiversity because part of chocolate, as well as other stimulants, might have been grown on recently deforested land. So there you can also check if it's rainforest alliance certified and those kinds of things. So that would be the third one to look out for. But yeah, again, by far, animal source foods. It's a bit of a tired story, but it seems to be that holds up.
Are those labels reliable, by the way? The ones like Rainforest Alliance, can you be sure that, you know, it did come from a very nice piece of land which hasn't been exploited in some ways, I guess?
Yeah, I can't speak to that. I don't know for sure. I know the food industry is continually trying to innovate on labels, both to boost their sales, but also to water down more stringent labels. So all the different labels differ to some degree, and one really has to do a little research basically on the side. So for example, there are like 12 different organic labels, right? And they all differ how stringent they are. But broadly, I would say, well, it's good that there are some labels, but yeah, the devil is sometimes in the detail.
Kind of bouncing off something that sorry, not struggling to phrase this question. You mentioned chocolate being a massive cause of biodiversity loss in the Amazon. And obviously, I think that something that is quite often kind of pushed with a plant-based diet is, oh, you can still have chocolate, you can still have all of these great things. And that sort of, like, there are lots of things that aren't taken into consideration when you move to a plant-based diet, in the fact that it's not just about cutting out animal products as the main driver of making your diet sustainable. So I was wondering whether you had any sort of insights on kind of things that you see people who are eating plant-based diets, almost mistakes that they're making, or big things that somebody who is already eating a plant-based diet could do to improve the sustainability of their diet further. So for example, things like maybe chocolate, maybe almond milk. I know that that's something with the water use, if you had any thoughts on that or anything around that question. Obviously.
Sure. Yeah, lots of people worry about different things. And I mean, I would say if you sometimes eat chocolate, is probably not a big deal. But if you eat chocolate all the time, then it's probably neither healthy nor sustainable. I mean, chocolate has fairly high amounts of saturated fat as well. So that's not very good. Lots of people worry about almonds and avocados. But the thing with those is it really came about only due to some case studies in specific production places. So in places like California with almonds, almond production was just so heavily concentrated there that water extraction was too high. That is not a problem of almonds as such. It's just because the farmers were allowed to intensify their production so much that they really depleted local water levels. So almonds are not more, water intensive than other nuts, for example. So you really don't need to worry about that per se. Same with avocados. There have been local issues in places like Chile where avocado farmers have bought up all the water rights and then exploited water levels too much. And here again, it's a problem of local environmental regulation that has really failed, and not that avocados are tremendously water hungry. I mean, and from a greenhouse gas perspective, they still have 20 times less greenhouse gas emissions than the sort of cold cut they replace. The thing here is that it's important not to, if you can, not to buy foods from places that are having those problems with intensive concentration of production practices. And here, actually, you can look where you get them from. So usually your batch of avocados would have a label to indicate where it's from. And the interesting thing actually is that most supermarkets would have multiple supply chains, so to risk diffuse, right? If one sort of has problems, they still want to get their produce in, so they would regularly change where they get their avocados from, for example. So for you, that means you actually don't really need to worry so much, because it would be more distributed than this one like heavy production place. And from a food system perspective, having a bit more demand for those foods that have been relatively less demanded is not necessarily a bad thing either, because it would encourage other farmers to take up growing those things, maybe in other places of the world. And in the medium term, the food system will change. And that is indeed what we need, right? I mean, yes, in the short term, there can be local problems, but we need in the medium and long term a shift towards more plant-based foods and towards a greater variety of plant-based foods. So I wouldn't see those things not necessary as a problem.
I have one last question before I guess we move into looking at what a local strategy for us would look like. A lot of people say that, if you leave animal products, you will end up growing the same crop, monocropping, and that will destroy the land that you're growing it on. Is that a valid concern, or is that not as bad as eating those foods that you left in the first place?
So cropping techniques are a concern irrespective of if you eat meat or not, obviously, because we all eat other crops too. Monocropping, yes, can be tremendously impactful also on biodiversity if you have high pesticide use, for example. So that's a thing that has to be addressed, as well as the reduction in animal source foods. According to our estimates, if everybody moved to a plant-based diet, for example, you would actually free up cropland, because right now about a third of all grain is fed to animals to grow them. So if everybody changed, there would actually be more land around for things like rewilding, growing bioenergy crops, doing other things with the land. So that's an additional argument for changing your diet.
I was
Mary, did you have any?
Now, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was wondering whether we could now move on to sort of your thoughts on what you think, kind of almost an idealized, perfect view of how institutions like Worcester College and other places that cater for large numbers of people can make changes to their menus in order to improve sustainability. What would be kind of your ideal future end goal for that sort of place?
So I think if you look at at research that has looked at canteen options, and here I could very much recommend the work that Emma Garnett, no relationship with Cara Garnett, has done at Cambridge University. So that was part of their sustainable food strategy, and their sustainable food strategy is really, really good. So I can really recommend that as a starting point. And as I said, they have taken beef off the menu just like that, and nobody really complained about it. So it's really there is really no good reason why something that is a carcinogen to humans should be in a public space. And it's not about like prohibiting you from eating it. You can obviously eat beef outside of your college canteen, but there is really no good reason why a public institution would serve something that is demonstrably bad for you and the highest emitting and environmentally degrading food product in the world, right? So there, no matter where it's produced. So I think there is a very good argument for not having beef and lamb on the menu. I recognize it can be divisive, and some people say, oh, it's like nannying, but it's exactly not nannying. You are always free to eat somewhere else, right? So it's really about making sure that if you eat at a public institution, that at least it's minimally healthy and environmentally sustainable. The second thing, maybe that is a little less controversial, is indeed to have those number of options there. So if, let's say, so there should always be a plant-based option, I think. So that is just a no-brainer, since that is so clearly the healthiest and most sustainable. At best, there should, so the uptake seems to increase with the number of options you have. So if you have 2/3 or 3/4 of meals that are actually fairly healthy and sustainable, then most people will choose those, right? So having not only a completely plant-based option, but also a vegetarian option maybe, or 2 plant-based options, and 1 option that is still low to moderate in meat, if people want that would be a thing to go, right? I don't know how many warm meals do you options are there usually in your college?
3.
Yeah, sorry.
We have 3: 1 meat, 1 vegetarian, and 1 vegan. You know, if there are vegans, yeah.
Great, so it's already like that. That's good.
But yeah, I think the assumption is that most people are going to eat meat. And yeah, I was wondering if we need to have meat at every meal.
Yeah, no, absolutely not, right? I mean, there is no, again, there is no health or environmental reason. It would be much better not to. It seems like similar to this like complete ban that in the past, when there have been strategies on saying, oh, there is a Veggie Monday or something like that, that has resulted in a thing where specific interest groups have rallied against it and used it to sort of cry foul, basically. So that needs to be carefully considered, obviously, right? And just having 1 day where you don't eat meat still isn't enough, right? So if you can make sure that most of the times people don't eat meat, whilst maybe still having the option, but making it relatively less appealing. So I think those pricing incentives might actually be a bit more impactful than taking it off the menu on 1 day. So if you indeed price in the environmental and health effects, and they don't need to be like completely like to the decimal point, but there is really enough information out there of how much more or less expensive it should be. And there is a good reason for increasing the price on something that is that has external costs on climate change and health. So just think about if your meat option is indeed double the price than the other ones, right? So it would be chosen much less frequently, I would guess.
It's very interesting. So for the moment, I think we have no beef and lamb at any time, and then having maybe more than 1 day where you don't have meat, or in any case, having multiple meals where you don't have any meat throughout the week. And Edward has just posted that this might be a bit classist to have some meals, to have meat more expensive, and only some people can afford it.
Yeah, that is sometimes it's brought up in the discussion on taxing meat. The thing is that not having that meat is actually a good thing, right? So it's health progressive for you, it's financial progressive for you if you don't have that more expensive meat. So you actually have the benefit. So it's almost classism actually reversed. So if you think you're rich and fancy and you can afford it, well, you're doing yourself a disservice and the environment, right? So together with that price incentive, maybe we need to also change what we consider aspirational and what deserves social shaming in some respect. You can also address this classism by maybe having also a very fancy vegan option every once in a while, right? Like a more high dining version instead of sort of something that is maybe a little bit bland. So you can play around with those things.
I quite like that creativity, to be honest. But yeah, I think it is a very valid concern. But as you say, I guess in the long run, if you're not going to have diabetes or high blood pressure because you didn't eat those options, it might actually turn out to be cheaper for you.
Yeah, so the signaling is really important, right? That it's not communicated that, oh, it's expensive because it has a high value. It's exactly the opposite. It's expensive because we don't want you to eat that, and it actually has a very low value.
Mary, did you want to ask anything else?
I was wondering, this was something I asked Tara yesterday, and I heard that it was interesting from a couple of people. So I was wondering whether you'd be comfortable sharing with everybody how you choose to eat and what decisions you make to ensure your diet is as sustainable as possible.
Sure. So I'm now plant-based for like 13 or 14 years. And for me, it was when I first time encountered results from those cohort studies I briefly talked about. So it was sort of, I think, a popular science book that alerted me to that. At that time, I was still studying physics. And I was so intrigued by that. I just had this vague notion of what is healthy and what is not healthy, as probably we all do. But I actually didn't realize how much of an impact poor diets have for you, right? So almost a third of all deaths are explainable by poor dietary choices. I mean, that is crazy if you think about it, right? Just it usually takes a bit of time to get those diet-related diseases because most of them are chronic. But yeah, when I heard about that and the very strong association between high meat diets on the other hand, and dietary ill health, and plant-based diets with the association with those with good health, I thought, oh, if I can cut my risk of getting some nasty cancer by a third or so and still have a nice meal, why wouldn't I do that, right? So I just said, yeah, no, I'll change my diet. And then I just experimented around in the kitchen for 3 months. I was constantly cooking and seeing what I like. And it was actually a great time. I really enjoyed that profoundly. And only later I connected dietary choices with health implications. And I think it's rather nice that it really, those dietary choices of more plant-based meals really combine a concern for the environment with a concern for your personal health, and if you like, a concern for animals too. So I think it's a really nice confluence of different factors, and you can actually really, or that's what I found, at least in my case, I really ate more consciously as well, because I knew what I eat is relatively more healthy and relatively more sustainable. And I really, I think that was a very nice thing. So I can encourage everybody to at least try it out.
Were there good plant-based options available 13 years ago when you started being plant-based?
Not very often. At that time, I was living in the States, and the States it doesn't have a food tradition really, right? But for that reason, it also had lots of ethnic restaurants. So, and very many Asian restaurants, for example, would always have a plant-based option. They just don't declare it as such, but it would always be there, right? So I had no problems whatsoever, and I always like cooking, right? So that was always good fun.
I'm conscious that we are coming towards the end of our hour. So I would just wanted to encourage anybody, if you have any further questions, to pop them in the chat. And Vihan, otherwise, I was wondering whether I could finish on on the question, which is if you believe that sort of beef and lamb is cutting out those two is the most sort of important change that we can make to our diets in order to improve our health and to improve the sustainability of our diets, what do you believe is sort of the second most important thing that we can do to go beyond that?
So from an environmental perspective, it would be clearly dairy. About half of the emissions footprint of our diets is due to beef and dairy combined. It always depends a little bit how you measure it, but roughly a third is due to beef and lamb, and then roughly a quarter is due to dairy. So that would be the next one. Dairy as such doesn't have a huge footprint, but we just consume so much of it, right? And that is really the problem. So from an environmental point of view, cutting out dairy next would make probably even more sense than cutting out other meats. From a health point of view, cutting other meats might be better, but anything that is basically not a food that is associated with those benefits takes up space, calorie space in your diet. So even though diet, for example, dairy is not associated with tremendous harm compared to an average unhealthy diet, or with a tremendous benefit, it's fairly neutral. It's still basically not as good as something that is associated with a benefit, like more fruits and vegetables or whole grains. So also there, cutting out on your dairy would make a difference.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for coming and speaking about that. I'm sure we could continue talking for a very long time about all these issues. I found it really interesting, and I'm sure that is echoing the thoughts of everybody else here. Vihan, do you have any closing thoughts before we say goodbye?
Yeah, I think that was a very good, it gives a very good sense of what we should be recommending and what we should be consulting our student body about, and making sure that they're on the same board as everyone else. And yeah, I think it's been a very nice week of talks, but we also have a third one on Friday with Forward Food, and they're an organization who had lots of success all over the world, helping actually lots of institutions in the educational sector transition towards low meat and more plant-based diets. And they'll be talking to us about their successes, but also the resistance that they've faced in countries like Brazil and the USA. And yeah, wherever you found this link, hopefully you'll be able to find the link for Friday's talk over there as well. So yeah, thank you everybody for joining, and thank you so much, Marco, for helping us, imagine a more sustainable way of eating.
Yeah,
thanks a lot. It was my pleasure.
Do you have anything you want to shout out or anything like that for anybody who's still listening?
No, not really. This was a great discussion.
No. Okay, well, thank you so much, everybody, for coming. And I hope to see you all, or some of you, on Friday. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining.
Bye.